So let's talk about architectural photography. Is it derivative or is it fine art? You see, there's a pretty persistent discussion going on for a long time now that if you're shooting architecture or other art structures like public art, question is it derivative of the original architectural creation? And is it actually plagiarism? Because basically, you're taking an original work of art, even if it's a building, and taking a picture of it and then claiming it as your own. For me, this is a bigger argument than this video will tackle, but I just wanted to throw that out there. If you hadn't considered it, it's something to consider. The Flatiron Building, one of my favorite buildings, and actually I'll pop over here because I want to talk about the project a bit. You know what you're going to be shooting. That remember the theme is architecture, and it's fairly wide open to interpretation. So if I come over to Pinterest and I just typed in the Flatiron Building, just to show you the variations. I mean, this is the same building. Obviously, like here's Edward Steichen back from 1904, one of my favorite images of the Flatiron Building. But based on just the idea of a single building, notice how many different ways it was captured, different seasons, different times of day, different points of view from looking way up to looking way down, using shutter speed to be a strong part of the image, breaking it up into triptychs. If you don't love shooting architecture, 100% okay. So you just have to somehow figure out how to imagine the theme of architecture, tailoring it to more of what you would like to shoot. So if you're more of a street photographer, then you'd have more street stuff in the foreground. If you love motion control, you would use some of those shutter speed effects, dominant foreground elements to set a sense of scale and space. Regardless of the city that you live in, you probably have some kind of cool building or architectural structure that you can reimagine and shoot in some really interesting ways. So I encourage you to do that. One of the things that I believe looks great with architectural photography, at least it gives you a lot of control if you're shooting outdoors a lot, is to use a neutral density filter. Again, if you just Google neutral density filter, they can be fairly pricey. Like if you get a variable neutral density filter, that basically means you have maybe 8 or 10 filters combined into one filter that you just rotate a ring and it gives you, 2 to 16 stops of neutral density. Think of neutral density as sunglasses for your camera, for your lens, but it doesn't change the color at all. Essentially, it just lowers the amount of light coming in the camera. And there's some times that might be important for you, right? Oh, and just as a quick aside, see, here's an 8X neutral density filter that you can get for 22 bucks. Here's one right beside it you can get for 12 bucks. Basically, stack these on each other to get more intensive effect. You can buy these little kits where you can slide them down into the little slots. You can buy them for your iPhone. So this part is what's really exciting, and I'll include this link as well so that you can see it yourself and read more about it. But essentially, gives you total control over the ambient light. So if the Sunny f16 rule is on a bright and sunny day, you're going to get at ISO 100, the lowest shutter speed you'll get is 1/25th if you're shooting at f16. Now, if you need that shutter speed to be lower so that things moving like lights, car lights, or clouds, you need that shutter speed to be pretty low to show the movement of that. Do the math. So that would be a 60th at f22. That would be a 30th at f32 if you have a lens that actually stops down that far, and most won't. Most people stop around 22 or 27. So let's just focus on the 22. So that's 1/60th at 22. So a 60th is hand holdable, but that's not going to blur moving stuff, especially things moving as slow as clouds. You really need to get down to 1 second or 15 seconds, that kind of thing. So, but if you put on a one stop neutral density filter, you're now at a 30th, and then a two stop takes you to a 15th. A straight on 16 stop neutral density filter, you can be shooting in midday and still get slow, blurry clouds tracking across the sky. And then the man-made structures, they stay very concrete and still. So it provides a really nice contrast. There's a more minor look at it. So here it is. And yeah, you get these wonderful abstract things. Now, don't go out and buy a $12 or a $200 neutral density filter just for this project. Do your research, watch some videos on it, and see if you like the concept of a neutral density filter. If you have a polarizer filter, that pretty much gives you two stops of neutral density effect right away. And it does things things that you can't do in post-production, like reduce glare on leaves. It allows you to see deeper into water. It makes blue skies bluer and green leaves greener by removing the reflective glare. It does some additional benefits. So if you don't want to spend the money on a neutral density filter and you're considering getting a polarizer, again, that gives you a couple of stops of neutral density effect, which is nice. But yeah, if you're only going to buy 2 filters your entire life, definitely a polarizing filter and definitely a neutral density filter. Remember that for every stop of ND filter, you have the amount of light entering the camera. And when the light is halved, to maintain the same exposure, you need to double your shutter speed. Add another ND stop, double the shutter speed again. How you do it. Now, let's take a quick look at this chart. Here it is in kind of graphical form. The original shutter speed for a correct exposure, and let's assume our ISO is 100 because you probably want that as low as possible, and your f-stop is whatever your f-stop is. The shutter speed is 1 second. If you do nothing, it's still 1 second. But if you put one stop ND filter, it makes it 2 seconds, right? If you put a 2-stop ND filter, you're all of a sudden at 4 seconds. A 4-stop jumps you to 15 seconds. And let's jump all the way down to a 16 stop. 16 stops makes that 1 second exposure 16 hours. You see how it just exponentially grows? Super fast. So let's talk about architecture. Obviously, we may or may not have access to some of this amazing architectural work, but I wanted to show you some contemporary fine art photographers who are making a living shooting architectural images. And again, it's easy for us to reimagine these images that I'm showing you in color, the different things you could do in black and white. So in architectural photography, you do need to think in terms of lines and shapes. These elements definitely need to balance within your frame. And once you take the shot, ask yourself, are the elements in the image adding to the story? And if they are, then that's when we're going to get to work in the post-processing. So is it better or worse with the person that's in the photograph? Did they add the person in the photograph or did they remove the person? Which one's the before and which one's the after? These are questions that you would ask yourself. One of the things I wanted you to think about is, what makes the image exciting to you? And some of that is going to be dictated by how you post-visualize this and post-process it yourself. And think about what's distracting. Right away, I don't care about this bird. It doesn't add anything to the photograph. If anything, it distracts from this architectural shot. And then these little light beeping things for airplanes, I think those are very visually distracting. But remember, we're trying to reimagine this as a black and white conversion. And when you're in Photoshop, you have the ability to reimagine it. So look at this reimagining. Much more dramatic, single point of source of light, which was created from a fairly flat image that's not very exciting at all. It's very centered. It's very flat for the exposure, but this is a really creative interpretation of that image. And I'm showing you this to remind you that, okay, because you see what you see every day in your city, you may think, that's not exciting at all. But close your eyes and reopen them again and reimagine what you can do with it in Photoshop if you can make it anything you wanted. So here's the neutral density shot. Notice how the clouds look long and like just blurry cotton candy. It does the same effect for water as well, for long exposure water shots, river shots, stream shots. Again, this is all done with a neutral density filter. And you see how it quickly isolates the man-made structures because they're rigid and linear and they have crisp highlights and crisp black points. But those clouds are just a creamy mix of grays. So obviously you may not have a travel budget, but again, one of your assignments is to capture an interior and an exterior. So here they've done both in one shot. And you need to, again, interpret this for yourself. So what if you're like, I really despise architecture. I despise man-made objects. I really love child portraiture. That's what I want to make my living at. That's the art I want to make. That's what I want to shoot. Then I just encourage you to figure out how to integrate child portraiture into the theme of architecture. For me, this would qualify in the theme of architecture. It just also has child photography in it. Now, maybe you want to go shoot urban desolate spaces, or you're really fascinated by just geometric lines. Let's take a quick look at this image. This is another one where like, okay, I'm not big fan of architecture. I'm more about space and depth and the interaction of people with nature contrasting against the man-made landscape. That's totally fine. You can interpret it however you want. So let's pretend like this is one of the images. So right away, we can tell it looks pretty visually flat, right? So if we do a standard standard conversion. It's going to be just very flat and lifeless, and it doesn't look like it has any rich blacks or rich whites. Let's look at the histogram. It doesn't. Look, we're missing probably 20% of all the pure blacks and all the dark tones, 15 to 20% of pure white and all the highlight tones. Remember, all you have to do is to increase the contrast of a flat image is just drag the black slider and the white slider to the base of the mountain, whatever's missing, and that will jump up the contrast. So again, here's where it was, here's where it is now, just with that very quick adjustment. So now I would add a levels adjustment layer, and what I would do is I would just really crank open the white and gray slider. So I'd reposition it so it's super bright. And so I'd have to invert the mask, making it black, and just paint out everything I wanted to brighten. So the goal was to brighten this rock and the people. See, that's where it was. So now I've adjusted the local subject contrast to make our eye go to what I want your eye to go to. And then here is just more adjustments, really keeping our eye focused mostly in this area right here, because our eye will go to the lightest area of a print or the most sharply focused. So if you have a travel budget, wonderful. Definitely feel free to take advantage of that. It can be abstract architectural shots where they're just shapes. That's totally fine with me. It doesn't have to be like a recognizable building shot for some brochure. These definitely can have a really fine art slant. Feel free to be very graphic in your processing, as in don't feel constrained that you must have pixel level detail in all the shadow areas. You feel free to treat some of the shadow areas as graphic elements with architectural shots, letting parts of the image just go totally black and detailless. And again, these are all contemporary photographers making a living shooting. In sections 9 and 10, I think that's the one where you'll actually be required to do some toning for your shots, like duotone, sepia tone, etc. So this photographer has toned the bulk of their images. And again, this would actually slide under the limbo rope of an architectural shot. I mean, technically half the image is of architecture. The other half is the mass amount of people living in a man-made structure, talking about the density of urban environments, the chaos. Again, you get to interpret how you want this project to go. So you decide what you want to shoot in the theme, the very general theme of making it architectural.